let me begin now by introducing our guest for this panel. Um, his name is Anand Giridharadas. Uh, I encountered him a couple months ago. I don't know exactly when I read his book, The True American, Murder and Mercy in Texas. Uh, I knew very little about it when the book came, and it was one of those books where you just start reading and you read the whole thing very quickly and with a gratitude for the person who wrote it. So it's a real pleasure to have Anand here. For those who don't know, he writes the Admit One column for the Times Arts pages and the Letter from America for the New York Times Global Edition. He's born in Cleveland, Ohio, raised there and in Paris, France. He's been a Henry Crown Fellow at the Aspen Institute, and he appears regularly on all those TV shows that we know, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and another one on The Daily Show and beyond. So we had an argument yesterday about whether The Daily Show should be a credential or not.
Or a degree.
A degree. He's ABD at Harvard in the government department, so I think now instead of that, he has the Daily Show degree, which is worth more, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
In any case, I want to get into this. I want to have a discussion with Anand. One of the beauties of the book he wrote, The True American, which is being made into a film, I've been told, is it tells a beautiful story, and it tells a compelling story. And there's at least two main characters in it. And I've asked Anand, we're going to start this way, but I'd like first for him to talk to us about this character, Rice. Introduce the character, who he is, and a little bit about him, if you could.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. And I'm sorry to be the post-lunch entertainment. I know how difficult that can be, particularly if you had both of your cookies in the box. So thank you for being here and for having me. This book is a true story. It's a work of book-length journalism. And I say that because what I'm going to tell you sounds untrue. But it happened, and it happened in America, and I think it has a lot to tell us about what it means to be American today. So it's really about two men, and you've asked me to introduce the first of them, Raisuddin Bhuiyan, who goes for short by Race, R-A-I-S, is, like so many of the people who came to this country over the generations, a kind of striving immigrant. He is from Bangladesh originally, comes to America in 1999, and people got here in a lot of ways over the generations. And some people came here out of desperation. Some people came here fleeing persecution. But a lot of people who came here, and this is a sort of undertold part of the story, a lot of people who came here were fleeing perfectly decent circumstances that were decent to everybody else around them except them. And that's actually a big part of the American story and a kind of the American DNA. We're peopled by people who couldn't stand things that their brothers and sisters often could. And he was one of those. He had a great life. He was an Air Force officer in his country, which was the top in that country. Bangladesh is a big peacekeeping country, so he would have been a fighter pilot, peacekeeper around the world, made good money, been in chauffeur-driven cars for the rest of his life. But something kind of nibbled on his ear repeatedly and always pushed him to the next thing. And that's how he'd gotten to the Air Force. And then once he was in, the whisper was, you got to get out and you got to go to America. If you want to do anything, you got to go to America. And in a time when we're very depressed about our country, it's worth remembering that in most countries in the world, a lot of people still get that whisper. So he got the whisper, and he came here. He came here any way he could. And now you have to imagine, Air Force officer starts working in a gas station in Dallas, Texas, in the summer of 2001, first in New York and then goes to Dallas. And it's a tough existence. He's working 5 a.m. to late night every day, But he has this very clear picture. He's going to work here a few more months. He's going to save up just enough money to enroll himself in community college. He's going to study IT. He's going to do this. He's going to do that. He's going to marry his fiancée by the end of the year in 2001. And he's going to become a big-time IT guy. And then 9/11 happens, and he meets Mark Stroman, who's the other character. Mark Stroman comes from a very different world. To say the least, a world that, from what I understand, you've been talking about in some of these other sessions. Mark Stroman grows out of a white working class in and around the Dallas, Texas area that in his family, but also in many families, has progressively been worse off each of the last 3 generations. And so his grandparents kind of owned a construction business and had a pretty big house, and his parents seemed to sort of work and have a home, but a lot of alcoholism, a lot of abuse, but they kind of had the rudiments of a stable life. And then he is one of these guys who is easy to think of. I mean, he ended up being a very horrible guy, as I'll explain in a second, but he grows out of a world where there are a lot of guys like him. And he's in and out of the law from age 9, getting arrested for things that involve slingshots at first, and then sort of graduate to chrome nunchucks, and then graduate to stealing a guy's pickup truck, and then graduate to, wielding a knife at some Mexican kids in high school. And progressively, he ends up where a lot of American boys are ending up right now, which is first juvenile detention, and then prison, and serves time on 2 different offenses. Each time is let out after a few months on 6- and 8-year sentences. And so it's kind of this deadbeat, but works. He's not part of the welfare story. He works as a stone cutter. He works in a body shop, not the skincare, the other kind of body shop. And after 9/11, this adrift man who had never been able to hold down a kind of decent life, and who was, as his wife put it, lived by the doctrine of hurt or be hurt, who had grown up with immense trauma within his family. After 9/11, this man became convinced that 9/11 was the purpose of his life, and that the U.S. government was going to do nothing. So he would not have been able to foresee that we're still in these places, including some that had nothing to do with 9/11. He felt that only he, Mark Stroman, could avenge these attacks. So he drove around to 3 gas stations in Dallas, and he shot the clerk behind these 3 gas station counters.
Thinking they were
Arabs, which is Dallas for Arabs, and thinking that he was fighting back and defending his country. He called himself the true American. And 2 of them, an Indian and a Pakistani clerk, 2 of them died immediately. In one of the 3 shootings, he shot with a bird hunting gun and shot a spray of pellets out of a shot. And 39 pellets went into the face of Raisuddin Bhuyan, the Air Force officer turned gas station clerk, into his eye, through his eye, 2 millimeters from his brain, 39 others through various parts of his face, but did not kill him. And so that's the setup of the story of 2 men who've lived 2 very different experiences of America, very different ideas, who kind of meet. And that's just the first chapter.
Yes, and what's unique about this book is then what Anand does is trace these 2 men first through their separate stories, going back and forward, and then towards their sort of common story at the end. Could you maybe give us a little history of how they get on this trajectory to come together at the end of the trial?
I think the thing that intrigued me about the 2 of them is they were living 2 very different ideas of what it meant to be an American. And so race was in that encounter in the gas station because of a belief that no matter where you were in the world, no matter how good your circumstances, they could be better if you came to America. And Mark Stroman was living that in that America already, and was living in America where almost no one around him seemed to believe that, and certainly no one behaved that way, and it was not really true for people, and hadn't been true in quite some time. And so they collided that day in the shooting. And so then I spend, a lot of the book talking about the next 10 years. And this becomes this moment on September 21st, 2001, becomes the focal moment of both of their lives. So Mark Stroman goes to trial, is charged with one of the three shootings as a murder, is sentenced to death, and goes to death row. The Pulaski unit in Texas goes to death row for the interminable wait. Race Bouillon has to now, as a fledgling immigrant who does not understand the system even in good times, now has to deal with this system with one eye that won't open, a mouth that is shut, caked blood, and he's let out of the hospital the day after being admitted with his right eye still not opening because he didn't have insurance and being shot in the face was a pre-existing condition. And so he wasn't a very advantageous client for that religious hospital that he found himself in. And so from just day two of the shooting, his story, the way Mark Stroman's story has the kind of the economy and the opportunity story in the country behind him, Race now has to navigate an America that actually doesn't work even if you're an upwardly immigrant once something goes wrong. And so he has to navigate the healthcare system. And he has to navigate trying to convince the Red Cross that he's one of the 9/11 victims in Texas, and the Red Cross saying there are no 9/11 victims in Texas. And trying to navigate his fear. He didn't understand the sociology of this country. He saw a bald white guy with tattoos attack him. Now, everywhere he's going in Texas, he's thinking, that guy looks like he's part of Mark Stroman's association, not realizing that a lot of people in Texas look like Mark Stroman, and dealing with that fear. But over the many years that they had, they both evolved, and that's why there's a book. Mark evolved by coming to terms with himself a little bit in the solitude of death row, figuring out what had gone wrong in his life, coming to terms with the story of his own failure and the failure of others that had created someone as angry as him. And Race rebuilds himself, rebuilds his life, gets a job at the Olive Garden, gets a job in IT, pulls his way up. And 10 years after this shooting, several years, 8 years after the shooting, Race goes to Saudi Arabia for the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, which is the fifth of his duties as a Muslim, the only optional duty because of the cost. He finally has money to go, so he goes.
He takes
his mother. This is promised to his mother. And they both cried the whole time. They never thought, they didn't think he'd live, let alone be able to fulfill this sacred obligation. And when he's in Mecca, he has this epiphany that God saved him that day in the gas station when he was sure he was dying, and that he never repaid God because he was so busy surviving, and that now was the time to repay God. And he decides to do that, and this is why I said you'll never believe this story is true, by publicly forgiving the man who shot him in the name of Islam and its notion of mercy, and then fighting a legal campaign against the state of Texas, against the governor of Texas, Rick Perry, to save his attacker from the death penalty. And he sues the Texas establishment in court, citing, among other things, Sharia law in his plea to argue that Sharia law requires mercy and compassion and that it's unconstitutional to execute his attacker.
It's an amazing story. You spent a fair bit of time with both of these men, right? Or did you not spend time with Mark Stroman?
I couldn't.
You couldn't. So you talked to a lot of people who did.
I have two very different types of testimonies. In a way, even though they're both current figures, and it's an interwoven story. So each chapter alternates, but there's a Race chapter, a Mark chapter, a Race chapter, Mark chapter. Writing about Race was writing normal nonfiction about a contemporary person, where it's a reporting thing. Writing about Mark was almost like writing a biography of a historical figure in terms of the evidence base. It was basically paper. When someone goes to a capital murder trial, even in Texas, it's a very thorough process, and there are 4,000 pages of documents that I have about Mark. And then I interviewed everybody who knew him. So I had to kind of put him together through others.
Great. One of the chapters that really was quite moving and illuminating about America today, and when you were talking about race, was this chapter about his getting a job at the Olive Garden restaurant. Some of you may know what the Olive Garden restaurant is.
You don't have to admit it here.
Yeah, but they're not in the zip codes that are contiguous around New York and Washington, D.C., or I guess they're in Times Square. What? Tell us about why you spent so much time writing about the Olive Garden and the culture that race had to navigate there and excel in.
There were two things about it. I really dwelled on that section. It's a full chapter. One, because just writing about the Olive Garden is really funny and fun, and the book really needed some comic relief, so it's all in the Olive Garden chapter. But two things really happen in the Olive Garden that were very important for this story. So Race, first of all, is looking for a job, is trying to figure out, he's basically been in the house hiding until this point. And he finally says, I gotta get over this fear. And so he thinks, okay, what job could I do that would keep me safe, that wouldn't expose me the way I was exposed in a gas station at 11 o'clock at night, that would help me overcome my trauma. So he thinks, I need to do a thing where there's a lot of people, and I need to overcome my fear of white people. And he just figures that the Olive Garden is a remarkable place to get over a fear of white people. And so there he is. And sure enough, there were people who came in tables of four that to him were like four people who looked identical. Right. Same tattoos as far as he could tell to the man who shot him. He sometimes went back to the kitchen and cried, and he had never served food before. So anyway, two reasons that it was a significant part of his evolution. The first was, it's where I think he became an American. And he did eventually become an American citizen a few years later. But it was the first moment where this guy who was kind of a very pure, very devout Muslim, very focused on his goal, started becoming an American pragmatist. And this happened because of a substance called wine. At the Olive Garden, he quickly learned that wine and beer and cocktails account for half of your tips. He did not know that. It's not true in where he comes from. And so he realized if he stuck to his Islamic notion that you should not even touch this stuff physically, he was going to earn half what everybody else was earning. And that wasn't working. He had $60,000 in medical debt alone. So he reasoned with himself and he said, well, God wouldn't want me to starve. And so he said, I'm still not going to drink this stuff, but I'll sell this stuff. I shouldn't say what the hell. And so he starts selling wine. And then he thinks, well, I shouldn't just sell it if they ask. If I'm going to do it, I might as well be good at it. So he starts going to all the fellow servers. And he says, tell me, what does this wine taste like to you? And he kind of finally boiled it down. He figured wine really had three tastes: crispy, chocolatey, and spicy, when you really got down to it. So he would just go to a table and say, welcome to the Olive Garden. And, with your bolognese pasta, I really recommend this. It's a very crispy wine. And I think you'll like it. And at the Olive Garden in Mesquite, Texas, that sort of worked. And he also learned little things like saying, welcome to the Olive Garden, are you going to the rodeo today? Which was not an abstract question because a lot of people were actually going to the rodeo nearby right afterward. So that was one, learning to kind of play the game. And years later, when he would take on Rick Perry and try to take on the entire Texas establishment, that ability to hustle and play the game and understand the media and understand how you can't just be pure but have to win became important. It's part of his becoming an American, I think. The other part of the Olive Garden was, a lot of immigrants from educated backgrounds like his, and I would say this is true about the family I grew up in, can kind of leapfrog from a privileged position in a very poor country into a kind of middle class and up existence in this country and really be unaware of how a lot of Americans live. Unaware in part because you never went to school here, so you didn't study. If you arrive when you're 25, there's a lot of things you just didn't study. and then unaware because of the way we live geographically. You live in a suburb 45 minutes north of New York or west of Washington, D.C., and you do your IT job or whatever, and you just don't really know the suffering. And that probably would have been Race's path as well if he'd gotten to his IT thing. But because he was shot and then attended the trial of this deadbeat white supremacist, and then worked at the Olive Garden, none of which were in his plan, he got an exposure to the American underclass that a lot of people of his background don't get.
And he didn't think much of it, did he?
Well, he thought a lot of them as people, but he realized when he looked at the people he was working with at the Olive Garden, native-born Americans of various races, he realized that people born in this country of that demographic who ended up working alongside him at the Olive Garden completely lacked access to the American dream that by that point in the story had started working for him again despite being shot in the face. And it was a lot of different things going on. It was partly the bad economy and those kinds of things, but it was also an intense solitude that he found. And a lot of us don't see it because we've been here too long. But he, with fresh eyes, was able to see things that were appalling and should be appalling to us. For example, he, by that point, though in debt, had gotten some friend to co-sign on a lease for him, and he got a car on lease. Very necessary in Dallas, Texas. A lot of his colleagues at the Olive Garden, he saw these women, sometimes pregnant women, walking on the margin of the highway in 110-degree heat home. He's wondering, this country, I mean, everything's so affordable. Why are these people, why don't they have cars? They're making decent money. And it turned out that they had the money to lease cars, but almost everybody who worked there didn't have anybody in their lives who would co-sign a lease for them. Didn't have a second signer. And he was thinking, what is going on in the richest country in the world where they don't have a brother or sister or uncle or aunt or parent who co-sign a lease? And of course, and you had Charles Murray here, and you have, people like Bob Putnam talk about this on the left. A lot of people have gotten at this issue of social capital. But Race was not an academic theorist. He was living the life and seeing that this dream for which he had come to America was starting to work for him, but didn't work for a lot of people born and raised here.
He came up with a theory which you call, or he called, or you called?
No, he called the sad life. And his diagnosis was, which I think has some truth in it, but is maybe not the full picture. He was particularly obsessed with how a lot of people were kind of beholden to a life of sex, alcohol, and drugs. And he, I think you can set the sex part aside, which may be his own view a little bit. Well, although a lot of the parents, unintended children, and people who didn't grow up parents. But when he got into the stories of his colleagues, they were to the person tragic stories. And I think this is a narrative that we're not really comfortable with, or if we are, we're only comfortable with it in kind of evangelical churches. And we're not comfortable having like a mainstream conversation about the fact that a lot of people in America are living extremely chaotic, precarious lives. And he immediately saw the connection between the Olive Garden colleagues and the man who shot him. And he understood that it was actually the same stories that he'd heard a few years earlier in the trial of Mark Stroman. And he understood that there was a kind of disease in the country that he wanted to start thinking about doing something about.
And in many ways, your book becomes about a number of things, but one of the things it becomes about is this disease, this sense that there's a working America and a not working America. And I don't mean jobs. I mean America that functions and an America that doesn't, which is to a certain degree what Charles Murray was talking about yesterday, and also, by the way, what George Packer was talking about yesterday, the fact that there are unaccountable institutions and the institutions don't work, and the fact from Murray's point of view that there is a bubble on the top that really works, even though it's hollow, and he says to the core, and a bubble on the bottom that doesn't work. So tell us a little bit was that something you came to writing this book with, or is that something you discovered writing the book, and if so, when in writing the book did you come up with that idea?
Both. I mean, I had the kernel of the idea before, which is what attracted me to the book. I mean, I hadn't done, my first book was a much more general book about India, where I was a foreign correspondent, and I'd never thought about doing a book on a single story the way this is. But what drew me to it was that I felt it was a way of exploring this larger idea that had been with me for a little while, which is that I felt myself surrounded by two different storylines. One of which was this was kind of the worst time in American history ever, and everything's horrible, and there was a good amount of evidence for it. And the other storyline was this is the best time in American history, and apps are going to change everything, and just and a lot of things, right? And there was a lot of evidence for that too. And I wanted to, so I started looking for, the kind of big thesis that I've been thinking about for a few years now is, I think we are living in some ways in the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression at the same time. And the people who want to tell us we're living through the Depression don't acknowledge that it's not 1% of us who are doing well. A lot of us are doing well. A lot, like, I don't know what the number is, but a quarter or a third of Americans live and work in great places for some of the best institutions in the world that are the best at what they do in the world, right? And that's not true in France or in Spain or in a lot of other Western countries. But a lot of us live in conditions that are already deeply second world. And the people who want to talk about how this is the Roaring Twenties and everything's great don't want to acknowledge that a lot of people are living through the Great Depression. And I just felt both were deeply true. And I, in the course of reporting the book, moved back and forth between both worlds, and I know they're both real. And so I was attracted to the story because I think it showed the two worlds, except they weren't fixed. It was the immigrant who came for that world, fell out of it, tried to reclaim it. And the killer who was in that failing America, who, when he finally on death row, gained contact through visitation and letters and pen pals with the America that works, actually started to become a better guy.
There's two questions I want to end before we go on to bringing the audience in. So the first one, though, is, and it's something you and I were just talking about outside, and I don't know if you want to read it. It's on page 121 of your book. You bring up a thesis that we were talking a bit about yesterday on a panel on freedom. Is America the land of freedom? And there was a debate at the panel, or a debate. It wasn't a debate. There was a question of, is freedom the idea of America? George Packer begins the unwinding actually with this idea that we are living through a time of almost too much freedom, which something you might have similarities to. Or do we need more to return to kind of unfreedom, a kind of sense of family and other constraints, and that sometimes talking about freedom is misleading about what we're looking for. And the book becomes, at least in its discussion of Mark Stroman and his world, a sort of meditation on the problem of freedom in America.
Yeah, and I just give a little bit of context before I read this paragraph. As I mentioned, my first book was about India, and I grew up in this country, the son of Indian immigrants, and I moved to India after college to reconnect with my heritage, where a place I'd never lived, and lived there 6 years when I'd originally gone for 6 months, and became a newspaper correspondent and wrote a book about that extraordinary change that's happening, not just in India, but in a lot of the developing world. And at the heart of that change was a celebration of the idea of freedom and the idea of the individual. And you have this, there are 8 different centuries and millennia old things in India that conspired against the individual. The caste system, class, economics, the kind of misguided socialism of the independents, a lot of different things. And in various ways, they all limited individuals from finding their voice, becoming themselves, their fullest selves. And so I wrote this great celebration of the coming to India of this idea of the individual. And I came back here and I started telling this story. And I realized in a strange way what I was doing. The uncharitable version is that I was contradicting myself. But what I was doing...
That could be charitable if you're...
Exactly. That I was chronicling a society at the very other end of that arc of individualizing. And that at the other end of the arc, it became something much less worthy of celebration. and that a lot of the people who are not doing well in America and in this story are people who suffer as much from the excesses of individualism as people in India suffered from the lack of individual freedom. So this is just a passage in the Olive Garden chapter where race kind of makes that connection about how people were kind of imprisoned back home versus how they were imprisoned at the Olive Garden. What race was perhaps discovering was that the liberty and selfhood that America gave, that had called to him from across the oceans, could, if carried to their extremes, fail people as much as the strictures of a society like Bangladesh. The failures looked different, but they both exacted the toll of wasted human potential. To be, on one hand, a woman in Bangladesh locked at home in purdah, unable to work or choose a husband, voiceless against her father, and to be, on the other hand, a poor, overworked, drug-taking woman in Dallas, walking alone in the heat on the highway's edge, unable to make her children's fathers commit, too estranged from her parents to ask for help. Maybe these situations were less different than they seemed. What Race was coming to see through his Olive Garden immersion was the limits of the freedom for which he had come to America, how chaos and hedonism and social corrosion could complicate its lived experience.
I think it's really beautifully put. We, as part of the lead up to this conference on Tuesday here at Bard, we had a debate, in the Bard Debate Society, co-sponsored with us, between not in opposition, but with teams from West Point and Bard mixed, which we do a lot, and we have a lot of cooperation with them, on the question of whether individualism is an American ideal worth fighting for. And we started with this idea of Tocqueville, who actually is pretty much the inventor of the word individualism, something very interesting. The word individualism is first used in the English language in 1827, and Tocqueville writes Democracy in America, Volume 1 in 1935, and he gives the first definition of individualism, and he says it's different from selfishness. Selfishness is a passion to do good for yourself. Individualism is a thought to focus on yourself and not on the common, not on what's meaningful in the world. It's to focus on your family, on yourself, on your wants, and not on the common good. And what he says is the great danger of American democracy is individualism. And yet the only response to that danger that isn't dangerous to freedom is, in a sense, more individualism, in the sense of self-government and therefore driving the individual back into the public sphere. And it struck me that that kind of thinking is something that would be very much along what you're trying to reach out to in this book. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
It does, and I think part of what I was, I don't come at this with an ideological framework. It's just not what I do. I do a lot of deep reporting and interviewing and try to figure out the story of what's going on in people's lives. And I pay a lot of attention to the language people use to also describe what they feel is going on. And the big conclusion I came to was that a lot of the people who are hurting in this story, but beyond, are falling between the cracks of the left and the right in America. And what I mean by that is, and it really has to do with this question of the individual, I think the left is very eloquent at caring about the most vulnerable among us, the weak among us, people for whom the system is not working, and is very eloquent about some of the causes of that failure: economic, lack of opportunity, the way big companies operate, structural racism, all kinds of things. The left is very eloquent on. But I think the left is very silent on a lot of the things that the people I was writing about will tell you are the biggest problems in their lives, which is the complete lack of family in many quarters of America, the fact that in the demographics I was writing about, and this is white America, by the way, like nobody has a dad. nobody has a dad. These are what I call fathers until conception, um, and that this is not the inner city hood that we tend to associate with this problem. This is becoming every race, every demographic reality, and not just that, but a lot of social corrosion that the left is very uncomfortable talking about. The right is more comfortable talking about some of those issues, is not comfortable talking about the economic and structural racism issues, and doesn't really care about the most vulnerable people or get votes from them. And so these people, their lived experience falls in between the cracks of the left and the right. And I find that very frustrating, given the amount of pain that you see out there. I mean, this is not just Texas. I travel a lot, and we were in a Walmart in Lancaster, Pennsylvania a few weeks ago. You can see what meth has done. Meth is happening everywhere. I mean, you could drive half an hour from here in any direction, you see what meth is doing. Meth is happening. Just one little example of meth. And you can see it in the teeth in the Walmart in Lancaster. And who is speaking to that? Because it doesn't really fit in anybody's agenda. And that's really what I wanted to try to put on the table.
Just the last question I'll ask before I throw it up is, did you have an answer of who is the true American, or what is the true American?
It would have been a much shorter book if I did. I mean, there's no doubt who I and who anyone reading this will think in this case is the better guy. But that's not what's important. I think both of them represent claims in American life to what is a true American, what is the true American spirit that will always be with us and that is more unresolvable. And I think they both represent that, whether it's the idea of a certain settledness versus the constant change of immigration, whether it's the idea of individualism versus community, whether it's the idea of kind of everybody do what they want versus there being certain fixed values. And these two characters fit on very different sides. It's not very neat. But I think what ends up happening in the book is so many of the important claims to what it means to be an American end up being embodied and taken up by so many of the characters who come along, and they kind of compete and joust in these fascinating ways.
Wonderful. It's a fascinating book. I guess it will also be a fascinating movie fairly soon. Are there questions that people out in the audience have? Do we have a mic? Yes, do we have mics that are available? There's a question back there right behind you, Clara.
Hi, thank you very much. I was struck by something which was, I would describe it as double profiling, how your hero, race, looks at Texans and they're all the same, and the tattooed Texan syndrome. And I wonder whether you spoke about that, because it's impossible not to think of this double profiling, this double problem. How can we really see one another as individuals and not part of a group? I think Roger's conference was wonderful at reminding us that, Republican, Democrat, that's not who we are. Those are some ideas that we adopt. How did that come across in your book, which I haven't read yet?
Well, I don't want to... I may have spoken too quickly. I mean, I never meant to suggest that race thought all Texans were those, but you have to imagine this is someone with a lot of PTSD from being shot in the head. And so when he walked into a lot of rooms, he saw those people who are not all Texans, but are also not absent from Texas. He saw it more than you or I would see it, because he was looking for... He could never get over the idea, he could never accept the idea that Mark Stroman was a lone actor. It took him a long time to understand this was just a single crazy guy. He felt that there must be some sort of squad who has this agenda. And he just didn't know when, out of this society that he didn't really understand sociologically, more members of this squad were going to pop up. And I think race absolutely does see everyone as individuals and is remarkable in that way, and is now doing human rights work, and absolutely sees people for all their humanity.
Are there other? Yes.
I have 7 questions, so I'll try to limit it to one. Fascinating, and I have not read the book. You speak about methamphetamine addiction in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I've spent quite a lot of time. It's also a community filled with the Amish, who don't have that problem to that extent. I'm wondering, in your investigation and your thinking, what part, if any, does spirituality play? What part did the sense that it's not all about tables and chairs, there is something more than the everyday, and did it impact either one of these individuals, or even your view of what's lacking or what's needed to address some of the challenges that you talk about?
I mean, I think it's a good question. I mean, if you look at the headlines of this big debate around Bill Maher and Islam and Reza Aslan and all of this conversation, this is true of every religion, which is, being religious is in a way a thing without content, because you can be wonderful or you could be terrible and be religious, or not be religious and be wonderful or terrible. So it doesn't, in itself, it doesn't really seem to explain these things. And I think that's true in this story. I mean, a lot of the people who are not doing great in this story, some of them don't believe in anything. A lot of them are very devout Christians. I don't think it's the operating factor. I think the operating factor, as far as I can tell, is in a lot of the, I mean, I'll tell you a little thing which I noticed, which is very striking to me in the reporting. So as I mentioned, I have this 4,000-page case history of Mark Stroman, and this is true whenever you have a capital murder case. Every piece of paper the government of Texas ever had on this guy in any agency ended up in the box. And so I have his physical, and because he had a lot of contact with the government, you, I presume, maybe don't have 4,000 pages worth, even if you were to do something terrible right now. But Mark Stroman had, Mark Stroman, he'd been in and out of the law since he was 9. So I had physical exam results. Doctor would look at him when he came in for an arrest when he's 9. I had the doctor's write-up and where his birthmarks were when he's 9 years old, what his weight was, what his height was. I had a lot of paper on everything, his test scores, his probation officer's evaluations of where he was every day for a 2-year period. And I had a lot of names of his friends, because he'd be arrested for stealing a pickup truck, innocent thing, and the guy who was sitting in the cab of the truck with him, name and date of birth in the police report. So I accumulated like 10 or 12 names of just people he was friends with when he was 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. He committed these crimes when he was in his 30s, right? I would run these names. On the internet now you can look up anything particularly to do with criminals. And I would just look up the names and dates of birth. And basically every dude who had been friends with Mark Stroman at age 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, all were in jail for violent crimes, right? So this is not one bad guy. Like, if you were in that demographic playing on the street with Mark Stroman, you were probably going to end up in jail for like long sentences for violent acts against another person. That's when it starts to become more than a problem of individual culpability. And again, those are very religious areas of the country. So I think there's something else going on that has much more to do with trauma and the abuse of drugs and alcohol and a lot of male failure. Another big thing which we could do a whole other conference on is a lot of this is a story of male collapse. And it's an economic story about the last 30 years of wage stagnation. It's also a story about men not being very good at dealing with the rise of women over the last generation or two and acting out in a variety of ways. And you could interpret, it's not how I did it, but you could reinterpret this book and a lot of the people who figure in it as really a story of male collapse in very large swaths of this country.
In the last panel with Professor Thomas and Professor Sleeper, Kendall Thomas brought up the example of Detroit. and then Professor Sleeper and he were having a conversation about this idea of coalition building or coalition politics, right? In the sense, let's take somewhat as an assumption that I hear you making, and to a certain degree, I hear you making this in agreement with Charles Murray, which is that class is becoming the determinant factor as opposed to race only. I'm not sure if that's exactly your claim or not, but it would be nice to know. But what Jim Sleeper was saying is, well, this is a both thing, and we need to have coalitions between working class, or not working class, lower class whites and lower class blacks. And you spent a lot of time in this world of lower class whites. Is that feasible? What's the racial? I mean, how did they respond to you? How did they respond to race and to race?
I mean, I think there's a lot of truth, and it's a little bit complicated. I mean, I think what the professor said earlier, that people like Mark Stroman were willing to accept an economic situation, in part because they were sold a story about cultural capital. So I think that's true, and particularly in the South, that's true. But I think it is the case, and by some statistical measures, people have said now class has become a more salient explanatory variable. But that's not really because of the end of racism. That's because of an enormous amount of white failure incrementally over the last 30 years of wage stagnation and China and globalization and other things. And enough white people have done worse that it's changed which variable does what in the Excel spreadsheet. I think in terms of the coalition politics, it requires us to. There's this great word which has been used in talking not so much about this, but about the kind of people who drive Uber cars and freelance for TaskRabbit, and this great word called the precariat. Right. So the proletariat, the precariat, for the kind of precarious lives they lead. And I think the story of precariousness, and we were talking about neoliberal economics before this, the precariousness of these economic times, so these kind of liquid times, is an important story. And a lot of people are living with this precariousness. But I think my big contention is two things happened at the same time, which in a way have nothing to do with each other, but have really hurt these people, which is an economic precariousness came in, which had to do with trade and globalization and China and policies and Reaganomics and all of that stuff. And a social precariousness started to happen in that same period with, like, for example, people not having dads, but a lot of other issues too. And the combination of those, I think if you have only one of those things going wrong in your life, you're still okay. But if you have both of those things not going well in your life, whether you're white or black or Latino or Asian, it's a very hard deck to play with.
And it raises also the question of freedom that you were talking about before, because many of the people who drive the Uber cars and do and work in this new economy where they do services find it very freeing. They can set their own hours, they can be their own boss, and there's sort of a new embrace among many people of, I'm working for myself, but no institutional support. One bad week, one bad month, one bad year, and everything changes. And
it's absolutely.
Are there questions? Students have questions? Yes, right here in the middle. Can we get a mic down here? Clara, right there. Can you reach down for that?
Hi, good afternoon. So, as I'm listening, I hear about these two main characters and how you went through like crazy just to get information on them. So, how would these two characters be beneficial to people reading the book?
That's a great question. There's a much better audience for fiction books. And so your question is something I ask myself all the time. Because if you watch the news and search the internet, you can tell a story like this with your imagination, and I could do probably 3 of these a year instead of the 2-3 years it took me. And so I often ask myself, why bother to? I mean, you won't believe how much time it takes to just listen to some of these tapes and make sure. I mean, for me, I put every and and when people change the sentence in the middle of a quote, I capture that with dashes. It takes a lot of time to capture reality in that way. And so I've thought a lot about your question. And I think there's a real value to going into real lives because hopefully people can see themselves in it partly, but more importantly, can see who they share the country with. And often we don't really, at an emotional level, know who we share the country with. We know they're there, we know they're people demographically like this, or that age, or that race, or that job, but we don't, at an emotional level, feel the feeling of what it's like to be them. And I think when you have the space of a 300-page book to go into a real person's life, hopefully some readers will read it and think, wow, I'm prejudiced against Muslims, but I never thought that that's what it's like to be Muslim. Huh. Or I am prejudiced against white guys from Texas, but I see this guy really, gosh, nobody with his parents could have had a good life. And that's the hope of this kind of nonfiction, that you are able, people can't dismiss it as made up. And so hopefully you get to see a little bit about who you share your country with.
I'm just going to channel my literature colleagues for a second and ask, is it for you is it so important that it be nonfiction? Could you not imagine a fiction book having the kind of power that it's a true story adds to a book?
I mean, fiction books have much more power because you can do whatever the hell you want. I mean, people are, even the most interesting people are often boring. Like Martin Luther King probably had 14 days where he said something extraordinary, and that's enough for the historical record. But like every day, he was probably sitting, going to the bathroom. People are dull when you're constrained to the reality of their day-to-day lives.
Let me ask: were there points in the book where you were really eager to sort of add something?
No. I mean, that's just not what I do. But thanks for checking.
No, not to say that you did. I'm just wondering if there were points where you thought.
I thought about it with my first book because I was struggling, and I thought about just taking the same themes and some of what I'd learned. The point I was making about Martin Luther King is you could easily if you take three people who are sort of interesting but a little boring, and you composited them, and you take this guy's marriage, this guy's job, and this guy's weird issue with his daughter, you could make anybody interesting. And, Barack Obama's memoir, for example, he admits that he composited characters, including people he went to Columbia with. I mean, with all due respect to the president, I think that's crazy. I think that makes it a novel. I'm very old school. Like, it's either true or it's not true. And, I have every conversation in this book on tape, if you want to check, and that's just really important to me. Particularly in a world of blogs and, there's just so much opinion and so much just ranting that I think the counterpoint to Fox News is not MSNBC. The counterpoint to both is just reporting and storytelling and actually saying what's going on and letting people think about it for themselves.
We have time for probably one or two more questions. Let's see back there. Yeah.
How soon after the incident, when the man got shot, did you begin your research on this book? And you said you never talked to the shooter. Was there a reason for that?
I was a little bit vague about that because I have to give up too much of the story to explain why. But for a variety of reasons, there was no chance of me meeting the shooter. I got involved in the story not around the time of the shooting, but around the time of 10 years later of Race's legal campaign against Governor Perry when he was in the courts arguing. And what I can tell you without giving too much away is as with many death penalty cases, including all the ones in the movies, it comes down to the last hour, and this is part of what they do to make it a little bit difficult to get off of death row. Mark Stroman's scheduled to be executed with lethal poison at 6 p.m. Central Time. At 5:55 in another city, in Austin, a judge finally agrees to hear race after he went to 4 courts, and the federal judges say this is really a state issue, and the state judges say this is really a federal issue, and finally, 5:55, he gets a hearing. The first thing they have to do is get a pause. Stroman is now on the gurney, lying down. They get a pause right before 6, so now they're just waiting. The visitors, they're just waiting, and race has a chance to go on the witness stand, finally, after months of pursuing this, and finally testify. And they ask him, why do you need this guy to live in order for you to be whole and for America? And he has his 15 minutes on the stand to make his case for this guy's life. And this guy's literally waiting on a gurney in another city. I won't tell you what happens.
Is there another student question we have for the last question? Yeah, down here in the front.
Hello. You mentioned how Mark pulled the trigger because he thought race was Arabian, and you said how he felt like he was a true American afterwards. My question to you is, what does it mean to be a true American?
My question to you is, what does it mean to be a true American? You didn't see that coming, did you?
You've been asked
What
that.
do you think
You've been
it
asked
is?
that before, haven't you?
Well, what does this tell you about the mentality of people who see others that don't look like them?
I think what Mark Stroman thought a true American was someone who looked a lot like Mark Stroman. And he didn't have a lot of place in his vision for people who weren't men, weren't white, weren't bikers. And so he had a very narrow conception. And I think, on the other hand, race represents a very different conception of being an American, a true American, which is that in some ways what makes us exceptional, to go back to the kind of theme of the conference, is what makes America such a crazy experiment is that in theory, at its best, it's not committed in advance to any particular kind of people. Now, in reality, that's not the case. But I spent a lot of time traveling in 40-something countries in the world. We still have it better than most other countries. And all the countries that people say are so lovely and liberal, like Norway and whatever, well, it's mostly people who look the same. We have failed at something many times. We've succeeded at this thing many times. But what we have tried to do as a country in terms of saying anybody, we can take anybody and make them into this thing called American, is actually more ambitious and insane a mission than I think anything any country's ever tried to do. And so the claim that Race was making to being a true American, although he didn't use that language, was the claim that being a true American is simply having the belief that you can be that thing. And I hope that that's a claim that continues to be argued for in American life, because I think it is what makes us exceptional.
I think that's a very nice way to end this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.